here is the problem, so to speak. Most discussions of geopolitics have a very familiar and I think limiting focus, which tends to be states. And so a lot of the literature, and actually I use the term geopolitics, I could say geostrategic, I could say strategic, but they all are meant to evoke the following sets of thoughts. Is that the structure of international politics is state-centric. It has been since 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War, and that the defining feature of international politics, geostrategic politics, political structures, is states. First. Second, the argument related is that geopolitics, i.e. states, have been and will remain the central feature of international politics, and that therefore a lot of the discussions that we've been having here, just beginning now but have been going on since 2006, are, not to hurt your feelings, though I don't agree with this, really peripheral, nearly irrelevant, because it's states that control this stuff. And that states are the defining characteristic or attribute of international politics, and that all the things that fit in the category of nonviolent conflict or ideological activities all are secondary to states. Third, however, that set of arguments, that logic, flies directly in the face of a set of events that began arguably with Serbia, later with Ukraine, with Georgia, and I haven't gotten to the more obvious issue now, which is the Arab Spring. So here's the issue that I want you to think about here as I go through this talk. And I can go through this in about 35, 40 minutes maximum. Plenty of time for Q&A, but frankly, my view is when you have a question or a comment, fire it right at me. Don't wait until it's all over. There's a slight risk I won't get through all this stuff. I'm not frankly worried about that. I think this, to me, personally, there's more spontaneity if at the moment the question arises, you ask the question. So whenever you want to interrupt me and ask a question, I encourage it. I like it, frankly. I think it's more fun that way. So here's the question you have to ask yourselves. Yeah, whether it's we call it politics or international politics, geopolitics, geostrategic, strategic, pick your poison. Do the circumstances that exist in 2011 with lots of cases now, increasing number of cases of democratic movements within societies, is this because or in addition to basic forces in international politics? So I could argue that these forces are occurring against the mainstream of states dominating international politics, and states dominating their own domestic politics, on the one hand. On the other hand, I could say that the basic fact, this is a little dramatic sounding, but I don't think it's actually far off, that is having to ask, are we seeing a fundamental rip or rift, or is the fabric of international politics being changed or shown to be changed by the events going on since the late 2010, early 2011? Now, those are a big set of questions. I don't think the policy community has at all wrapped its arms around this sort of issue. In the first FSI in 2006, I gave a talk toward the end of the week on this question of how the policy architecture, the policy-making architecture, in only the case of the United States, but it's actually very representative of the rest of the world, I don't think the interagency processes in governments and societies are at all equipped to deal with the forces that are going on now. So we could now, and I can categorize this in different ways, we could say that the events now are a parallel successor events to activities that occurred 20 years ago when the Soviet Union came unglued, when that whole structure blew apart, and did so peacefully. We could say, on the other hand, and again, I'm not into school solutions here. These are judgmental kinds of things. You're going to have to wrestle with them individually and frame this in your own ways. I could argue that there have been certain technological changes in international politics that I'll get into in a bit that actually suggest that this may not be a successor to the reform movements, the democratization going on in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union during the late 80s, early 90s. And I don't know the answer yet. Now, I do know that an increasingly important part of all this is this question of social media, social technology, new communication forms. And I'll get into that in a little bit. As you all know, though, these were and are instrumental in the reform movements that we see going on really across the Middle East. So you are, I think, in a really interesting time historically and analytically as to what's going on here. And it could be along the lines of the same pattern. This could be really different. If it's the former, if it's just a continuation, then probably the changes we've seen in international politics with the end of the Soviet Union, democratization in Eastern Europe, that it may have a certain predictable course to us. On the other hand, if the second proposition is true, then we're in really uncharted territory, and the reality is we don't know where we're headed. My gut tells me it's probably closer to the second than the first. It tells me, second, that the changes in international politics may be so profound as to be unrecognizable. It tells me, third, and I'm very optimistic by nature, it tells me that we could have very unpredictable, potentially chaotic circumstances as this unfolds. And that may just be the nature of what we're dealing with. So what I don't want you to think is geopolitics, strategic policy, foreign policy, whatever, ho-hum, same old thing. This is not same old thing. This is different. And you are at a moment, you're now 4, 5, 6 months into an era, an epoch, a moment for which the end is absolutely unclear. And I think the end is more unclear given the democratization, not of societies necessarily, but of communication and the decentralization of communication that allows all of you and multiply the size of this crowd by 6 or 7 orders of magnitude, hundreds of thousands, millions actually, tens of millions, to change international politics in ways that I think are highly unpredictable and, frankly, utterly unrecognizable to the policymaking community just about everywhere, frankly. Now, without pinging on any administration, I could look at the Obama administration. It's been pretty, my term, if I want to be critical but not snarky, from your point of view, is
Does everybody know what snarky is?
Does everybody know what snarky is? Anyone not know what snarky is? Oh, come on. Snarky. Anyway, what's snarky? Sarcastic, critical, well, actually, how many watch American television on occasion? Saturday Night Live? Case study in snarky. So if I'm trying to be critical but not snarky, I'd say it might be episodic. Look at American policy reactions 2 years ago now to the reform, to the movement, the events in Iran, versus Egypt, versus Tunisia, Egypt, Libya. It's been kind of episodic. I don't think that's malice aforethought. I think what that is confronting something pretty new and unrecognizable. So let's just talk about this a little bit. Now, if you know the answer to this question, where's Darren? Or Hardy, you can't answer. I'd ask you, what do all these, I have actually several of these, what do these have in common? Bahrain urged to stop military trials of protesters. Syria faces U.S. pressure to stop crackdowns. Tunisia, will democracy be good for women's rights? First cracks appear in Saudi's forced calm. Bahrain demonstrators get short shrift at trials. Iran, silent Tehran protesters arrested on anniversary of disputed vote. Bahrain students jailed for reading of protest poems. Or Jordan's king bows to demand for elected cabinets. International outrage as Syrian troops storm northern town. Syrians pour across Turkish borders. Syrian infighting suggests Assad's grip on power is slipping. Thousands protest in Bahrain. What do all those... Yes, first name.
Like blog posts or Facebook posts or tweets.
From
within Middle Eastern protesters.
From where?
Middle Eastern protesters.
Yeah, that's close. That would be a partial credit answer.
Headlines of
Close.
newspaper headlines.
Kind of, arguably close.
Citizen journalism.
Yeah, okay, sure. That's not the right answer, but I'm gonna pretend that it is for a second. Yes? When I say this, you're all going to go, oh, gee.
All from the same region.
Yeah, they are. And actually there's more. Yeah, warp response to calls for democracy, Libya, human rights first, Syrian...
News heading
From
the online website or something like that.
God, that's kind of close. Yes, and first name. Oh, you had the hand up. No. You're just holding your apple. Sorry.
I want to
Which digest?
I
Yes. Andre, yep.
You read our Reader's Digest, don't you?
Now, I need a pledge from the whole crowd. How many are going to go back and read this all the time now? Come on, come on, come on.
All the time.
Now, here's the other pledge of anonymity. Don't go back and is anyone tweeting as I'm speaking? Show your hands. Don't reveal this to the next group next year. You can't do that. It's just we can't talk about this. Now, so you talk about all these events. Now, if you look at these, not entirely, but just about, all from what region? Middle East. And Northern Africa. Yes. Yep, Jim. Yep. Now, let's step back a little bit and sort of a discussion where people are talking about going up 10,000 feet or down 10,000 feet. You know, remember I said 50,000 foot view? This is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek comment. Remember, over 15,000 feet, there's no oxygen for you, you're going to die. So go high enough and there's no air and you die. So don't just be aware. Now, now this is just the last handful of months. And look at the juxtaposition. Peaceful demonstrations in Tunisia and Egypt, violent state responses in Libya and Syria, all within roughly the same historical epoch. We have increased repression in Bahrain. We have prospects of demonstration on again, off again in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, others.
Morocco.
And Morocco, thank you. We have growing instability in Yemen. We have really, the way I characterize this is the geopolitical or geostrategic fabric of the Middle East is at least in chaos. It may be being ripped apart. And my own personality is, my own intellect is, be cautious about the really inflammatory statements. But I can't help but think that when I look at these kinds of events, that something profoundly important is happening, much more out of our realm. Now be aware, the way we're organized biologically is we detect important stuff close in. We prioritize threats as they're closer to us and much more perceptible. Therefore, things that are way out in the future, and I think this is headed toward things way out in the future, have a more unpredictable, more unrecognizable quality. What do humans do in the face of uncertainty and unrecognizable patterns? They hesitate. They slow down. They stop. They allow inertia to rule, which is typically to slow down or at least maintain steady state. So I think this, to me, if there's one thing you remember from this talk this afternoon, is this. And I should frame it as a question. I can't make it a declaratory sentence. I'm not sure it's the case, and I therefore have to frame this as an uncertainty. We don't know for sure, but that certainly is what we're worrying about. So if I step back and say, all right, are there ways that we can categorize current events, geostrategic events in the Middle East, which is not our laboratory, but it's where a lot of the activity is occurring? We have an interesting and potentially unsettling a set of qualities. Peaceful demonstrations, violent state responses. And we take Egypt, and we can really just say peaceful demonstrations and not seriously, but essentially nonviolent Egyptian responses. We look at Libya, and we have exactly the opposite case. We have constant evidence of government repression. And if you recall the reporting on Egypt, I mean, there are people who know more about this than I do, but high unemployment, high poverty rates, no economic opportunity, inflation rates, food price, all these things are generating political, social, economic pressures. We have societies with corruption, societies with no hope for people. Now, all of this, I can't reach that high, but if I could and I drew a line right here, I'd say, well, is there a lot of history for that? Yeah, tons. I mean, all of this is stuff that we've seen in myriad forms for millennia. But what's different, and here's why I think we can at least raise the question of profound geostrategic change, is this right here. This is wholly new. This is on a scale to make these kinds of things not particular or peculiar to a society, but part of the broad geopolitical framework. That is different. And I think so profoundly different as to raise the question, not make the assertion, raise the question as to whether geopolitics is changing in a way that will make these kinds of forces increasingly unacceptable and potentially implementable as a source for and a basis for reform. And that, why is that? Why am I saying that? Because now, for the first time in history, I think I'd argue, but Reverend Lawson might quibble slightly, and I'd be respectful of that. I might disagree, but I'd be respectful. Is these movements now, mass movements with varying levels of effective or ineffective leadership, have the technology to end run governments. That's new. Even 20 years ago, with events in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, societies didn't have, organizations and groups couldn't end run governments very effectively. And I'll come back to the case of Egypt and some of Egypt's responses. So I ask really several questions that I want you to think about. Yes, Hardy.
Yeah, sure. Just on your previous slide, you talk about the importance of internet technology. And it'll get into a bigger discussion later in the week when we talk about digital activism explicitly. Yes. But while those technologies may be game-changing to some degree, I would argue as well the old rules of activism still apply. The old rules of organizing, having a concrete message, listening, being receptive to grievances. So when people talk about a new normal because of these technologies, they're impactful, but they don't obviate the great deal of knowledge before it. In fact, they may amplify it.
I strongly agree, and if we reran the tape, yeah. Nothing I said contradicts that, but
no,
I think your emphasis is excellent. So
yeah.
What Hardy said is, yes, and yeah, Aishman.
Yeah, and even the means to operate Facebook and Twitter, electronic new media, that also lies in the hands of the state. So the state can actually cripple the movement's ability to use that technology.
That's true. However, look at the case of Egypt. What happened? Who's from Egypt here? What happened when the government shut off email and internet?
But it was international pressure which led them.
Yes,
to
it was.
that. But what if that pressure wasn't there?
But it was.
I mean, but it's yeah.
But actually, it backfired because first they tried to cripple the activists, so they stopped Twitter and Bambuser, which were the activist tools, and then they had to crack down on Facebook, which is social networking. And then the entire Egyptian people knew that something was wrong because Facebook was closed. And then they had to shut down the internet altogether. And that had a cost on stock exchange, banking, and so on and so forth.
And it brought more people onto the streets.
And it brought more and more people. Once they shut down mobile phones, everyone was out on the streets.
Eventually they go back to the print shops and print the stuff out on hard copy paper.
Sure. They do, yes.
Yes. But the pivotal factor now was the stock exchange and the digitalization of soft services like banking services and all these other things. That was the pivotal factor at the end of the day.
Yes.
Which caused the internet to come back online.
Yes, indeed. So to me, government policies, and I think in most cases these governments are not, they're inept, they're fragile, they're highly rigid. In fact, that step, to me, as somebody watching this from the States, was a catalyst, not the only catalyst, a catalyst for driving events in Egypt in directions that the government would have viewed as antithetical to their interests. So to me, the important issue is, is everybody comfortable with where we are? Okay, so big picture kinds of questions, just things I want to wrestle with, and I've said before and I'll say it again. No school solutions here, I'm raising issues. I want you to think about them and you'll form your own conclusion. Is there a fundamental geopolitical realignment underway? Do nonviolent protests, are these the new normal in international politics? Well, we'll see. Are these forces now redefining how societies not only evolve internally, but given the connectivity that exists globally, is that connectivity and those redefinitions rippling across various societies? And is democratization in whatever forms, and I know that term is loaded, I'm just using it as a placeholder for dismantling repressive, authoritarian, highly centralized governments. I am not saying the alternative is necessarily better. I am saying that is at least, again, I'm being defensive because I understand the baggage on democratization, but it is part of, it is the alternative that I see to describing these other kinds of governments. So let's just talk about some of these things here, and again, ping when you have a question or comment. So the overview, the big picture here, nonviolent strategies now in the ascendance. I actually think that if nonviolent strategies were consistent with international politics in the past, though resisted, I think now arguably we see an era, an epoch, a moment when these may actually be changing the fabric of international politics. And if that's the case, then I want that part of the focus now is how this all happens, and more importantly, what it all means. So I said this before, geopolitics, it means the intersection between societies, politics, geography. We could use geostrategic, it doesn't really matter. But basically what I'm saying is nonviolent conflict is now increasingly aligning with international politics, I think partly because of, largely because of communication technologies and a growing acceptance of these norms. But it also, this is the easy statement. The harder statement is it redefining global conditions? And I'm not declaring that, but I'm gravitating toward that viewpoint. So geopolitics is the right place to start for a bunch of reasons. One, this helps us understand what are the central trends and ideas and issues going on. Second, it provides a social context within which groups, movements, individuals, societies interact. And third, this intersection between nonviolent conflict, societal change, and technology is something that we don't understand, but we understand it's something, sorry for this, that we ought to understand better. And I also suggest to you, if you haven't read, there's a famous text, Politics Among Nations by Hans Morgenthau. How many read Morgenthau or familiar with him? And he has something in there described what he called the fallacy of the single factor. If someone says to you, the factor that caused the protests in Egypt is X, don't believe it. It's multiple factors. And that's why in the early talked about politics and economics and a range of and social and religious and other factors that impinge on a particular moment to cause a particular historical event. So don't just think it's one thing. So if someone says to you, the reason for the great change is technology, be cautious. It's usually much more than that. I really said this in a sense, but I just want to be aware. So this is nonviolent conflict is now being shaped by all these forces, and I don't think we can understand nonviolent conflict without thinking about geopolitics, and I'll come back to these issues of communication, internet, and transparency. In fact, what I think we're seeing now is a new ideology of transparency, a demand for openness, a demand for information, and this demand crosses borders. And again, the events in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya are all exemplars of that new ideology of transparency. And again, I'll come back to those kinds of issues. So let me just talk about a couple of issues. Here, to me, are some rules of geopolitics, but feel free to quibble with these. And I will argue that they are evolving. One, we have sovereignty, and sovereignty is defined by states. That's how we define the notion of sovereignty. We talk about the authority within a society that is absolute authority on the part of the state. On the one hand, President Truman, by the way, had a very famous quote. Any economists in the room here? No economists?
Ibero is an economist.
Who's? Well, anyway, President Truman said, he said, I wished I had one-handed economists, because what do economists say? On the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand. On the other hand, I can provide later, if you'd like, a list of cases and instances in which the international community has violated sovereign rights for various reasons related to genocide and others. So it's not as inviolable as it used to be. Second, territorial integrity of states. Third, legal equality of states. Again, we can show examples where that's not the case. A respect for universal human rights. This is clearly in the ascendant. The role of both international and domestic institutions and rules. And all of these, I think, which is interesting, have been weakening now. But the next statement I make should not be interpreted to mean the state is going away. However, the role of the state, the influence of the state, is diminished now in contrast with a decade or two or n decades ago. I'm not saying the state's going to go away. I don't think that's the case. But I will say that the power of the state in the face of modern mass communication technologies and the ideology of transparency is something that is now radically different than it was even in the most recent past. And I think it'd be interesting to go back and it'd be interesting to rerun events of the late 80s, 89, 90, 91, with the demise of totalitarian, authoritarian governments in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So, state's not dead, but its power is being eclipsed. I didn't say that it's dying, though. Trends. So first is norm. Second is trends. Globalization versus globalism. Globalization is describing the ability of ideas, money, everything to move across borders. This number is 10 years old. At the time, late 90s, early 21st century, the number was that about multiple trillions of dollars move around the globe daily in terms of global markets and communication. That's a big number, and I know it's much bigger than it is today. I think total global goods and services is what, $100 trillion a year-ish. Second trend, communication, social media. Think about how many use internet? Now, this is a stupid question now. How many use the internet? No. How many don't use the internet? How many use Twitter? How many have Twitter accounts? Okay. How many use Facebook? Do you know, by the way, that Twitter and Facebook, particularly Facebook, is not secure? Yeah. Political campaigns, the movements that use all this stuff. So what we have now is this notion of a norm of ideas spreading around the globe and the process by which it occurs. We now have the communication mechanisms that are utterly decentralized down to individuals in a classroom in Boston at Fletcher today that is essentially, not entirely, but essentially independent of broader communication networks. I mean, you're part of it, but you can operate without really having to build your own networks. And that's brand new. And that's why this is so powerful nowadays. We can all, for the price of a cell phone or a laptop or equivalent, we can now access the global web. Other trends is transparency and openness. It is an expectation that events occurring in societies, and this is an expectation often unmet, but the public expectation is, in fact, that events going on in governments and societies ought to be open and transparent. We don't adhere to that norm all the time, but we expect that to be the case. We also see, again, I'm cautionary about that term, but we do see more democratization than we had in the past. And I'm fully aware of all the debates about how we define democracies and the methodological and other food fights that occur in those debates, but whatever. And the same with free market economics as well. I'm not saying other forms of economic discourse aren't relevant or germane. I am saying that we see more of this than we've seen.
What do you mean by democratization?
I mean, Jim, the process of openness and the process of self-determination in societies, in an ideal sense, clearly eclipsed by various governments and organizations within societies. So I describe it as, it's as much an outcome in certain cases as it is an aspiration in others.
Okay, but
Quibble.
Yeah, I'm not going to quibble. I'm going to oppose them.
Okay, attack.
How do we deal with then the whole very, very secret, undercover development which the IMF, the World Bank, World Trade Organization, and multinational corporations are boxing in nation states on various kinds of contracts, trade agreements, whatnot, in which the state has no veto. NAFTA is just one illustration in there. So how do you deal with that whole element now that has to be considered a part of geopolitics, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. And my argument, several responses. One is the processes I'm describing do not exclude the possibilities you're describing.
Of what?
They do not exclude the possibilities that you're describing.
Okay.
First. Second, I remain cautiously optimistic that in the face of broad social movements, broad principles of transparency and openness, that those kinds of agreements, relationships, and pressures have diminishing, not zero, but diminishing utility. It's harder for governments and being pressured by or being supportive of these kinds of relationships to do so in the event of in the full public glare of the media and the scrutiny that can be generated. So I'm not. When you see these terms, I'm not saying we've entered a world in which all evil has been removed. What I am saying is that these kinds of pressures are moving to an environment which openness creates greater pressure on institutions, both in the public sector and the private sector, to adhere to norms that are more open, less secretive, less controlling. I am not to say that those more malign aspects have been forever removed from the body politic. The look on your face is skepticism.
It is.
Well, that's all right.
When in our own country elections basically are purchased by money that no one knows where it comes from. Even a local council-like election is being purchased by big business aspirations to control.
I'm going to be Truman-esque. On the one hand, on the other hand, we do see and have seen the last couple of decades growing levels of participation in elections. So remember, I'm not taking the purest viewpoint here that what I'm describing eliminates all social, political, economic ills. What I'm arguing is that we're seeing an ascent of forces that put greater pressure on societies, to which they respond varyingly, to deal with these kinds of problems, difficulties, evils.
Okay, but right now in the United States, there's a very, very good chance by bills and local government promoted by big money, big institutions, big financial institutions, that several million people will not be allowed to vote in places like Texas, Indiana, Florida. Will not even be able to get up to the polling period by this whole business of IDs, business of arrest records and whatnot. That several million people will not be allowed to vote. A whole new operation that's based not on color or creed or language, but based upon what? I'm not sure.
And I know in New Hampshire, I live in New Hampshire, for example. Who else lives in New Hampshire? Somebody else does. Yes, Troy does. New Hampshire is a debate going on. You don't know, New Hampshire is about a half an hour that way. New Hampshire has a debate going on right now on whether you have to produce an ID to vote. And the arguments go, I don't want to resolve that issue here, but it is an issue that...
But what I'm saying is that issue is a moneyed issue.
And see, I would argue yes, and it's also a political procedural issue. To me, it has multiple dimensions.
Well, I think that's right, but I also think, however, that fundamentally it is the moneyed sources in the United States dismantling the possibility of transparency and democracy.
See, I would argue, but we'll end it here, but I would...
Just make like one encapsulated comment?
Yeah, let me just say, I would argue that the contending force is the transparency of those who are appearing to vote. And I'm fully confident we can work this thing out, but Hardy, go ahead.
I don't know if this reflects what Jim's saying or not, but just a thought. The difference between democracy and democracy that's corporate-backed. And that functionally, while on paper those systems may look similar, functionally they may be increasingly divergent. So divergent, in fact, that democracy, when backed by corporate power, it is starting to constitute its own system of governance, for better or for worse. I think probably most people here would argue. On the one hand, on the other hand. But
fair point. But we won't resolve that today. Point noted. Sure. Okay. So the other is, and I just want to mention this, and I know you're aware of this, is this proliferation of technology. I'll give you two obvious examples. Email provides a proliferation of communication mechanisms based on pretty sophisticated but easily accessible technology. Point one. Point two, in terms of knowledge about where you are, anybody that has a relatively, not even too recent telephone, it can be geolocated with GPS. Even a building like this, because it's not really that, it's not, the GPS signal would get through here. So that gives a level of knowledge and information about a society that within societies and among societies that is very interesting and important. And the other part is this notion of media dealing with the forces that I described before. So what are emerging geopolitical norms? One is the desirability, the value, the ascendance of nonviolent conflict, and to me, under the broad aegis of democratization or democratic change, democratic reform. Second, in a growing sense, if I look at the events in the last handful of months, ignoring Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, others in the past, that it's permissible for groups and movements within societies to intervene using nonviolent conflict, going back to the events in which Jim Lawson was involved 50 years ago here in the States, but on a much broader global scale now. And this has issues related to humanitarianism, self-determination, freedom, human rights, free speech, so on and so forth. Other big norm to me is transparency. To me, the norm that rides above all the rest is transparency, openness, knowing what is going on. Not perfectly knowing what's going on, but knowing more about what's going on than existed a year or a decade or multiple decades ago in the past, nay, going back centuries or more. Now, of these norms and rules and trends, I can't weight them. I can't say the norms are more important than the trends or the trends are more important than the ideas. I don't really care. That's your choice. But you need to be thinking among these, which are the most important. My own view is norms probably are are changing this at a more fundamental level. But just be aware that's something that you can judge for yourself. I'm only going to mention democracy promotion as part of that geopolitical hierarchy, and I really don't want to, as I said, I want to relitigate that. Keep in mind, in terms of instruments of power, there are other instruments of power. We talk about soft power, which is what I've been describing so far as all soft power. I haven't really mentioned hard power at all when we think about military power or direct application of a state of economic power in terms of sanctions. I haven't really mentioned that if you think about it. I've been talking now for 35 minutes and change because I think this is, if you will, the intellectual policy sweet spot nowadays. It's these norms, ideas, values, and the ability to communicate them that is changing societies more than hard power. And I think I'd argue that the application of hard power tends not to slow down, but to accelerate that which it seeks to oppose. The test case today, for which the answer is unknown, remains, of course, Libya. We don't know the outcome of that struggle between government repression and government military responses on the one hand to the activities of the various rebels that are fighting in Libya. I don't know the outcome. The NATO view is, and the American view is, eventually Gaddafi will be killed. Maybe yes, maybe no. The assurances have been going on now for months. I don't know. Does soft power of movements overpower the hard power of regimes? I think more yes than no. Libya would be the no case. Tunisia and Egypt would be the yes case. And then there's the TBD cases of Kuwait's and Bahrain's and Saudi Arabia and Yemen's and on down the line. And I actually might put, I think I could put, I'm not doing this in an empirically systematic, rigorous way. I think there's more data here on the yes, that soft power is more important than hard power. I think that's the case. And I'm a firm believer, when you don't know, you say, no. Yes, Mohammed.
I think the case of Yemen is different.
I do too. Yeah, I do too.
Because in Tunisia and Egypt, simply the army has set aside. Therefore, they undermine the rule of the whole regime. While in Yemen, the military, the army is part of the government. And all the movement of soft power movement being going on in Yemen doesn't undermine or overpower the regime. So there is like a kind of like controversial issue here.
I agree. I am heatedly agreeing with you, Mohammed. And after I said Yemen, I thought, no, I shouldn't. I said, oh, well, forget it. Nobody will say anything. And then Mohammed.
Not with this crowd.
Yes, Gada, and then Susanna.
Do you necessarily believe that soft power is strictly for movements? Sometimes it's used by regimes.
No.
Yes, I mean the last sentence, soft power of movements overpower hard power of regimes, but there's...
Right. Here's a couple of... Go ahead, sorry.
Soft power of regimes. I mean, the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states are such a case where they use economic carrots and sticks. And,
yes.
It's soft power. It's not flagrantly violent. It's not...
Yes, I agree. My defense, the defense of the scoundrel, is, remember that question mark? Second, if someone says to you, do you necessarily believe, the by and large safe answer is no, right? Do you necessarily believe? No, I don't necessarily. I'm not discounting at all, not even remotely, the soft power available to regimes. But I think the soft power of regimes tends to be less effective, not always, largely less effective than the soft power of movements first. Second, I believe that the hard power of regimes tends to be more limited. I'm thinking of the cases, for example, of Egypt, where they had the hard power, and they made that decision not to do so, not to use it for a variety of reasons. And I think regimes tend to have a fragility and a rigidity that makes their application of hard power in an environment where what they are doing is being beamed across the globe. I watched the events in Egypt just about in real time, as you all did. I'm not establishing absolute categories here, but I am saying that I think the soft power of movements is a very formidable weapon or instrument against the soft and hard power of regimes. I think I'd argue further, you'll probably get me in trouble, but that's all right. But I think I'd argue further that, in fact, it was the soft power of the movements plus the global communication network that said to regimes such as Egypt, don't use the hard power that you obviously have available.
They used some of it.
Yeah, but they didn't use it on the scale.
Over 1,000 killed and over
Understand.
5,000 maimed.
Yes, I am totally aware, but and I don't want to go in this line of argument, but had they moved in different directions, it would have been a lot more than 1,000 who had died. It could have been tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. So that's the point I'm making. Somebody else had a question. Yes, actually, Susanna did. Okay, great. And Teresa.
I don't remember the author's name, but there's Susanna Carter. The Third Side. The program on negotiation. Has anyone?
Probably.
Yuri?
Yes.
Yeah, Bill Yuri, yeah. I thought you were soft power Joe Nye, but yes, sir.
Right, so I think his thesis is essentially that in terms of the world as it's developing via technology, that collaboration and cooperation make more sense financially, politically, in terms of even security, than the kind of military adversarial positions that we've taken in the past. So while I appreciate the attribution of kind of maybe it's an insinuation of movement building and the soft power that's utilized there, it's also as though the world itself, the way in which technology is changing the way we interface and are so globalized, that soft power makes much more sense. That's what you use to your customer. And we are kind of in a consumer relationship to each other. The only time that hard power gets used is when the exploited, so what would that be? There's the consumer and then there's the producer. When the producer rises up and says, wait a minute, I have nothing and I'm being exploited, it's like the old story. That's when the hard power gets used. But it seems like almost less and less that there's...
I don't want to...
Actually, I want to just find that part out. But yeah, it seems as though the world is moving, according to Yuri, and I think I agree with him, to the soft power, efficiency, and efficacy by virtue of technology.
That's what I've been saying. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes. Teresa, yeah.
So maybe you'll get into this, but there's a dimension I'm lacking, and that's the dimension of organized crime. I think Lisa from Colombia was touching up on that in the morning. Because whether we like it or not, the major sectors in society globally, weapons, drugs, smuggling, and trafficking, and it's completely beyond the control of most governments. In some countries in West Africa, like Guinea-Bissau, you don't even have grand corruption, you have state capture. The state doesn't exist anymore. And to what sort of entity should a soft power-oriented movement then direct its energy? Because whoever is accountable for organized crime isn't there. It's everywhere. But maybe you're going to get into that.
Yeah, I won't tackle organized crime directly, except to say that it operates obviously in the space between the states and societies. It employs soft power technology pretty effectively in terms of cyber, for example, stealing resources from banks and financial institutions and corporations and the like. I'm not going to get into it directly, except to say it's part of that development cycle within societies. And my own view is this is probably an American view. When it gets serious enough in societies, it tends to be a catalyst to do something about it. I fully recognize how difficult it is to deal with that, and I think Russia has been a good example, an excellent example. In fact, who was dealing with? Yes, Simon. I mean, you know more about that than we do, but It's an issue that societies have to deal with. Okay? How are we doing time-wise? You know, if my credibility goes to zero if I exceed whatever limit of time I've established, which I haven't established, as you note. No. So, elements of dramatic change in international politics. I've mentioned a number of these, but I just want to come back to this notion of communications, and I want to come back to the notion of transparency and the norm of revolutions. I mean, this is the new, as Hardy mentioned, this is the new norm in international politics that we're watching now. There are certain other forces in international politics I just want you to be aware of. I don't think they don't undermine, in my own mind, the views that I've been articulating so far, but we do have fragmentation and disintegration and chaos. We do have states that are failing or failed. We do have nationalism, ethnic, religious conflict that occur. We have regimes and we have states and empires, for example, the former Soviet Union that blew apart in the last couple of decades. And of course, we have these other kinds of proliferation issues. And we have now, based on the proliferation of technology, the ability of individuals to challenge authority in ways that they could not in the past, and to communicate that in a systematic way. I've said this. So let me just see, do time management. Let me just see where I am here. Great. Okay, perfect. Good, good. I'll be done in a couple minutes here. So I think geopolitics is being reshaped by nonviolent conflict, not that geopolitics is somehow looking the other way, looking askance as nonviolent conflict arises. They're two very different points. One makes nonviolent conflict and these notions of democratization, transparency, openness change, use your own terms, changing international politics, not international politics going along with these kinds of forces. And we see this on multiple dimensions, and I think there's a growing consensus, at least in the Middle East, and I think more broadly in a strategic sense, that we're seeing these forces in the ascendance, not in decline, and not at the whim, perhaps, of regimes. I also think that we're seeing now a laboratory, if you will, in international politics for the forces of nonviolent conflict. Again, I've said this now multiple times, the case of the Middle East. And think about cases where nonviolent strategies have provoked massive change in societies. I suspect this list will get longer over the next couple of years. And I also then I raise the question, I think you're all better prepared to answer this perhaps than I am, but where might these strategies work and where else might these strategies work? As I said, I don't think this is the end of the list here, at all. I think a year from now, this is actually a good prediction, I'd say every year for the next several years of the FSI, I'm guessing this list will get longer.
Maybe even this year.
You really? You think so, Karim?
I think due to the if we take recent tendencies with the deteriorating economic situation, I expect it might move. And
you made as a throwaway phrase in your comment, you made an immensely important point. I think in fact I would argue that what we're seeing, one of the reasons for the ascendance of these forces is economic forces, is economic decline, poverty, lack of opportunity, inflation, shortage of goods and supplies. So we could go back to the argument that fundamental geopolitical structures and structures within societies are determined by economics, and that economic difficulties may be provoking these kinds of forces of change.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I mean, in the case of Belarus, it's really interesting. Yes. When people come out with political demands, I mean, all those rallies are crushed very quickly. But recently, people came out twice with economic demands, and government and the authorities didn't act at all.
They probably had a somewhat stunned look.
What if you're sandwiched between dismal economic opportunities and a repressive regime which doesn't mind using violence? Mm-hmm. In that case, the only option for non-violent movements is to economically cripple the regime by doing mass strikes. Right. But if that is not an option, if it's a dismal economic situation, so you won't engage in non-violent struggle. And even if you do, yes, the government can use repressive tactics. I'm talking about in the case of Myanmar. Right. Because that's the situation over there. So non-violent strategies don't seem to work in that scenario because the people don't have an option to, start massive strikes across the country because of the economic situation in the country.
Unfortunately, you put your finger on a really important exception to the rule I'm articulating, which is good. Not for me, but it's good for you. No, but it's a good point because In most cases, I'm generalizing, but I think fairly. In most cases, the global economic market, if you will, can put and does put tremendous pressure on societies if they don't adhere to principles of free exchange of goods and services and ideas. On the one hand. On the other hand, there are those sad cases. Burma, Myanmar is one where the regime has been, for the last 20 years, help me with this, has been able to resist these impulses, these pressures, I should say, from the international economic climate. Question, and I'm optimistic in with regard to the following question. My own instinct is that the ability of regimes to resist that is finite in the shorter rather than longer term. That is of no value to you, that statement that I just made, if it means another 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years of repression within Myanmar. But from a strategic point of view, and I can do that because I'm not from Myanmar, but from a strategic point of view, I think I would argue that long-term the pressures on those regimes likely will break them.
It seems to me it's also important to pay attention to how regimes support each other to endure this economic pressure. Like Venezuela starts economic relations with Belarus. Why? Just because the regimes are similar, because geographically they're very far from each other. China also supports some regimes. Russia supported Belarus for certain
Belarus helps Gaddafi.
Yes. You see this inter-cooperation between the regimes across the globe. And it seems to me it's important to pay attention to how to destroy these links also, because we try to separate them from the global economy, but now they start to cooperate each other.
Yes, go ahead. Just a brief comment on that note. If you compare the recent NGO laws from those countries, you can see that they're almost copy-pasted. To my knowledge, actually, they were written by the same lawyers' company because they're very well written, remarkably well written. So, and these governments, they have the resources to meet and compare notes, whereas the non-violent social movements, they don't to the same extent.
Yes.
That's something I think from a funder's perspective, so to speak, something we need to look into.
I would even venture the following hypothesis, which is somewhat radical. I think long-term, the forces you're describing here, nonviolent conflict, social change, political change, economic change, I think that bodes well from our point of view, poorly from the point of view of China, likewise with Venezuela. And again, this is a longer-term sort of hypothesis, but I think long-term economic forces can have such a corrosive effect on regimes as to undermine their ability to maintain more repressive political institutions. But I'm not saying this is a short-term phenomenon. I fully understand it's not. Yes, Tim.
Just want to make a quick comment on that. I mean, when we talk about these conflicts and situations, I think we tend to look at these crises in very black and white, sort of like situation like us and them. On the other hand, it's not the case. For example, my own country, the Burma case. We try to look at it from the international community perspective, and then the U.S. and other countries, and including the UN, try to impose all kinds of restrictions and sanctions to the regime, and then the regime is not even paying attention to them because it's not just us and them anymore, because they also have their own, international small communities that are fully functioning, fully supported, so that whatever we do, we define ourselves from this side of the international community, but within the international community as a whole itself been divided. So until we are able to see that and then try to work with the other side of the international community, I think only then we'll be able to influence these crises in these countries, especially my own country, in terms of pressuring the regime to bring change.
Yes,
so just to understand, not just black and white, just there's so much going on within that. Burma has about 14, 15 countries currently doing business with them. So this regime is not going to go away by just putting pressure from our own international community perspective.
Such movements are changing the nature of states. Where you have nation states that are agile and flexible, responsive to the people, responsible to popular sovereignty. They mute, morph, alter, transform themselves in response to the popular clamor. And as movements emerge, they can be highly successful. What you see in the Arab awakening is in part, a breaking of the father-son succession, the breaking of the patriarchal, almost an Oedipal interruption and breaking of a traditional form of nation-state that is irrelevant in today's world. It doesn't work. It's got to collapse. It's got to break. But other states, in response to nonviolent movements, are going to become have more tensile strength. They're going to have more ability to be responsive to the people. When nonviolent movements emerge, they have to start fragmenting authority. The people have to become the authority. There has to be dispersal of the power centers. You heard Jim last night. One point he didn't make, but was important, is that the civil rights movement was a movement of movements. There were movements all over the country. So I think in addition to what you're putting out, we're seeing a profound transformation of the actual character of the nation state by such movements.
I would strongly agree, and it would lead to the corollary question, which is, what kinds of changes do we envision in societies in a world in which the forms of communication have outstripped the ability of governments to respond? And that's not just, that's all governments, I think. In fact, you look at the ability of governments to respond to public pressure through the media, for example. Not always, but usually they're more rather than less inept. They're less able, less effective in dealing with these kinds of issues and problems. So yes. Somebody else had a question? No? Okay, let me just wrap this stuff. So I've said this, actually. You know this. I think geopolitics is responding to nonviolent conflict, not just merely accepting of nonviolent conflict. I think there are growing opportunities for nonviolent conflict. Remember what I'm doing. I'm looking out, I'm being sort of a clinician in terms of looking at international politics, and I'm trying to set out a set of concepts and ideas that I hope mess with your minds a little bit in a good way, which is to think beyond. We're way above 50,000 feet now. We're really looking over this broad span of international politics. But I think when you do this, it says that when you have cases of repression and dictatorships, minorities that are oppressed or oppressed, all of these forces are putting pressure on the international system, on states, as Mary has observed, to help change societies. And I think I'm going to come back to this notion, even though I know it's politically out of vogue. But to me, these are forms, one way or the other, of democratization in societies. However you want to frame it, however you want to operationalize it or put this into practice, I think this is the set of notions that is changing international politics. Now, there's no guarantees all this will be successful, but I think the cases that are going on today suggest that it, in fact, will be. I've said this. This is much more timely and relevant than it was even a handful of years ago. I've said this. So, big picture questions that I'm going to leave for you to ponder. Do these underlying geopolitical forces reflect a temporary or a permanent shift in the structure of international politics? My own view is it's more permanent. But I think we're at the early stages, and I don't know the consequences, but I think they will be more positive in terms of diminishing the ability of states to engage in more repressive kinds of policies. I second, is communication the defining aspect in this geopolitical change? I think it is. I really think, and this goes back to work that a very famous political theorist here in the States, Karl Deutsch, wrote about in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And he talked about the role of information communication changing societies and norms and values. He had a following interesting thought experiment. He said, if I control, this is a book called The Nerves of Government. I strongly commend that you go take a look at this work. The Nerves of Government by Karl Deutsch, D-E-U-T-S-C-H, Karl W., The Nerves of Government. He said, if I control all forms of communication to you, all information provided to you, do you have free will? And his argument was no, and he was one of the progenitors of thinking about the rise of communication in changing societies, changing politics, changing norms. And I think this is, and if you want the example of how important this is, the discussion we had a little while ago with Gada and someone else on the response of Egypt to Egypt when the government shut down the internet and email and cell phone technologies. Didn't slow it down. It was throwing gasoline on a fire, and it exploded. And so now a question for the future might be, if governments are so aware of that possibility, how will it change their ability to, what will they think, what will policymakers think in those societies as they try to respond using either hard but more likely soft power. Shutting off communication, to me, is soft power, not hard power. How will they respond next time? You'll have to ponder that. So I think there are more opportunities for this. I told you before, I'm giving you judgments, analysis, interpretations. I can't ground this in mathematics. This is judgmental. This is the absence of school solutions. You're going to form your own views in that. One of the things that we say at Fletcher is the value of strategic, critical, analytic thinking. It doesn't really matter so much to me or many others what conclusions you derive. It matters that you think about them in an active, aggressive fashion. I think that's pretty close to the... Are people pulling this up on the laptops? How many are looking at this? Can you do that? Oh, well. Yeah, I've said this. So my last... before I ask if you have any existential crises, I was going to remind you of a story that has been attributed accurately to President Eisenhower. And they asked him when he was president, they said, well, I think we were talking about this at dinner last night. He said, he was asked, what was the most important experience that you had in preparing to be the Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Europe on June 6, 1944? Now, they thought he would say, being in Washington, which is kind of an oxymoron for people. How many have lived or been in Washington? Yeah, so you know. In the summer when it's hot, they thought he'd say his time in Washington, time in the War Department headquarters, all that stuff. He said none of the above. He said his most important experience to prepare him for those responsibilities was his 1 year out in what is called Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, at what is known as the CGCS, Command and General Staff School. It's like a war college for majors, for the Army in this case. He said that was his 1 year that he had time to think. That is what this is about here. And that's why what I'm talking about here are sets of issues that I don't expect any of us to resolve now or next week or next month. But I guarantee on airplane rides or in doing work or walking or whatever you're doing, these issues will come back for you to think about them. And it's not the resolution necessarily, it is the process of thinking about them that's so important. So that's why this talk is really designed to yank you way up above the curve of the earth. How many watched the British show Top Gear? Anyone ever seen that? It is an absolutely wild show. It's three Brits that have this show on cars. One of them, James May, had an opportunity to go up in what is called the U-2 high altitude surveillance aircraft. And this thing, and he brought a film crew. This plane goes up to 100,000 feet of altitude. At which point, this is now way over 50,000 feet, right? You see the curvature of the Earth. You can see the Earth and space. And what's really interesting about that is when people go up to those altitudes, it's common, they get a giddiness, a euphoria. And he kept apologizing to the pilot. He said, I'm so sorry. He said, I'm just babbling on because you warned me. There's a sense of euphoria that I have seeing this for the first time. So what I'm warning you now is if you get moments of euphoria, don't blame me. Thank you all. Thanks.